I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of Astral Affairs Rambova, and I want to read my book to you. And then, America reacts to Rudolphvalentino's revelations. Natasha's unwavering confidence in the authenticity of Rudy's revelations was met with widespread mixed emotions. The news she was co-authoring a book with her deceased ex-husband made front-page headlines for a day or two in almost every newspaper from the New York Times to the Morning Register in Eugene, Oregon. To cynical non-believers shaking their heads over their morning coffee and newspapers, Natasha Rambova had just lost her mind. There was little gray area in the acceptance of Natasha's otherworldly manuscript. Either it was scoffed at as ridiculous fantasy or embraced as definitive proof of life after death. As Natasha clarified, Rudy had nothing significant to say from the astral plane in regards to Pola Negri. La Negri issued her swift response. This prompted more headlines as America stayed tuned for an imminent confrontation between Rudy's last two lovers. Quote, "Profane and commercial," breathed Pola from her Hollywood castle as she read the messages. "Shocking and profane" were even added as she registered indignation and mayhaps envy. In fact, Pola would intimate that Natasha had been breaking astral confidences. And what is more and worse, Pola was not even mentioned in these astral tete-a-tetes. Natasha did not stoop to pick up Pola's gauntlet, so the Hollywood press pursued Rudy's first wife, Jean Acker, for her reaction. Quote, "Rudy did not believe in spirit messages," said Ms. Acker. "He was intelligent, and if such messages were received by his second wife, they were too sacred to broadcast." Among Natasha's more outraged critics was Bess Houdini, the widow of prestidigitator Harry Houdini. Now, Harry Houdini died shortly after Rudy, also succumbing to post-surgical sepsis. Houdini died after advertising he could absorb any blow to the abdomen. This proved not to be the case. Bess Houdini reported she also received messages via mediums allegedly from her late husband. Unlike Natasha, the widow Houdini left no doubt how she felt about those messages. Quote, "I considered them an insult to my intelligence. Miss Rambova's accounts of the antics of the dead seemed sacrilegious to me." Appreciation of revelations would be expressed by Natasha's New York theosophical acquaintances and her fellow Saturday nighters. Many of them participated in George's seance and held faith in his abilities as a medium. They also acknowledged as legitimate the subject of communing with the dead from the astral plane, with the furor leaning predominantly in favor of those ridiculing Natasha for inspiring the row over spirit talk. When Love Grows Cold's director Harry O. Hoyt issued a statement in her support. Hoyt's statement appeared in the news a few days after Pola Negri, Jean Acker, and Mrs. Harry Houdini's criticisms, and did not garner first-page coverage. It read in part, quote, "I had never taken any particular interest in seances, although I have attended the average number and come away cold. However, both Clive Brooke and myself came away from that seance feeling the man, Georgewehner, told us things no one knew but ourselves. Miss Hudnut, I think, is and always has been very much in love with Valentino. And knowing her sincerity and Wehner's ability, I feel sure she would get some kind of messages from the other plane." End quote. Despite being the target of skeptics, Rudy's revelations inspired spiritual discourse, and many a sermon was delivered on the possibility of life after death. As wire services dutifully issued the reports, some columnists were unable to resist the mocking, such as the author of one column titled "Over Teacups." Quote, "Will wonders ever cease? After all the pomp and show prior to the disposition of the earthly remains of the late Valentino, we find that he simply won't stay put, He is back again as a citizen of the astral plane." End quote. Revelations proved a daring theosophical move for Natasha. The attribution of one half of her book to psychic messages from the movie star Rudolph Valentino made the theosophical aspects of it all very Hollywood indeed. Was Natasha assigning the role of Mahatma to Rudolph Valentino? The curious crossover interests of Rudy's grieving fans and theosophic spiritualists created a quizzical demographic of readers, all enthralled by Natasha Rambova's production of Blavatsky and Valentino together on the astral plane. The authenticity of Revelations is still questioned, and surely always will be, depending on one's beliefs. Were Natasha Rambova and Georgewehner insane? Were they of sound mind? Or were they prophets? For those closest to Natasha, Revelations remained a long love letter, which she received from Rudy as he crossed over. No one who loved her blamed her for allowing George to keep Rudy alive long enough for her to survive the reality of her loss. The New York Evening Graphic's composigraphs. All the criticism and mockery in the world did not dampen Natasha's resolve. She sought a publisher for her book, which she originally titled Rudolph Valentino on Team. She would later change the title to Rudy, an intimate portrait of Rudolph Valentino by his wife, Natasha Rambova. As promised, the second half of her book was attributed to Rudolph Valentino, those revelations transmitted from the astral plane. News that Natasha Rambova was shopping a new manuscript garnered the immediate interest of Bernard McFadden. The eclectic health and fitness guru was the publisher of many popular magazines, such as True Story, Physical Culture, and the newspaper tabloid The New York Evening Graphic, and consequently held a broad reading audience captive. On McFadden's invitation, George met with the publisher on Natasha's behalf. McFadden presented the medium with a proposition. He would publish Rudy's Revelations in his tabloid and serial format as a means to advertise the full volume. Despite Bernard McFadden wielding unquestioning power in the publishing world, his evening graphic was reputed to be one of the lowest of the low in tabloid journalism. The graphic's sensational content was irresistible, with its coverage being primarily sex, crime, and scandal, everything from a good hanging to a raid on a speakeasy, with lavish illustration. These illustrations were often created in the form of shocking composigraphs. A composigraph was a graphically generated image, a sort of collage or precursor of Adobe Photoshop. Bernard McFadden alleged these brazen cut-and-paste news photos were not necessarily created to fool the public, but to illustrate a story. Quote, "The graphic did things with photographs that respectable newspapers wouldn't think of doing. The graphic was most famous or infamous for its composigraphs, often startling front-page images created in the art department by cutting and pasting the faces of celebrities onto the bodies of often scantily clad models posed to illustrate some real-life scene where a camera simply couldn't go." Despite the graphic's awful reputation, McFadden was successful in convincing George and Natasha to test the waters by allowing him to first publish Revelations. Natasha should have seen it coming. McFadden's penchant for a ripe composigraph opportunity. At the time of Rudolph Valentino's death the previous August, the graphic's picture editor Frank Mellon created several notable composigraphs to exploit the star's passing. One image depicted actors dressed as medical personnel posing in a hospital operating room, with Rudy prone under a sheet on the operating table. Frank Mellon created additional composigraphs depicting Rudy in his coffin, of Pola Negri paying her tearful tribute, and even the funeral procession. By creating fake images, the issues of the graphic, with the cover composigraph of Valentino's funeral procession, were selling on the streets of New York just as the actual procession began. Confused participants in that procession were buying copies of the graphic to see if they could find themselves in the photograph. When McFadden's first installment of Rudolph Valentino's Revelations hit the streets, it was obvious he had taken full advantage. Natasha and George were speechless. On St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1927, the graphic devoted a full cover-page composograph in the day's final 5-star issue to Rudy, wearing a white robe, standing next to Enrico Caruso, overlooking a vista of heaven's souls, portrayed as a panoramic perspective of scampering humanity. Natasha and George were mortified and protested the exploitation to Bernard McFadden. George lamented, saying the images, quote, nearly broke our hearts, but which we were powerless to stop. McFadden forged on to publish another installment, which displayed a composograph of Rudy, again in heavenly robe, conversing face-to-face with Helena Blavatsky. When McFadden sent news to Natasha and George, reporting how sales of the Revelations editions were titanic, their anguish over the tacky composographs was tempered. The response, good or bad, was overwhelming, and people were eagerly reading Rudy's words from the astral plane, whether they believed them to be authentic or not. The graphics exposure of Revelations was a profitable ploy for McFadden, but Natasha did not grant him the honor of publishing her book. She would decide on Hutchinson and Company of Paternoster Road in London. Although resoundingly sneered at by cynics, her book was generally well received. With her account of life as Rudolph Valentino's wife providing a juicy glimpse into the rarefied world of the Valentino marriage, even Revelations critics tolerated their inclusion in the book. In London, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle reported he was hard-pressed to keep the book stocked in his bookstore. Recognizing the public's interest, Photoplay magazine featured an article by Frederick James Smith titled, Does Valentino Speak?, in their February 1927 issue. The magazine posted a disclaimer stating that their publication of their article was not the magazine's endorsement of life after death. In the article, Natasha reiterated how Rudy watched his own funeral and how he was frustrated attempting to speak to his friends as they processed by his coffin in Campbell's funeral home. She advised his public by saying that when their adulation waned, he would be free to become more absorbed in astral world activities, saying, quote, he, Rudy, wants Earth people to know and realize that there is no death and no separation. He wants Earth people to miss his heart-rending experience. He wants them to realize and believe in the beauty and perfection of this afterlife, end quote. The Photoplay article, replete with an image of Natasha's face gazing into a crystal ball, was presented as her unwavering defense of Revelations and an overt expression of her love for Rudy. New love. In the spring of 1927, Natasha made an appearance in a courtroom as a reporter covering the Snyder Gray murder trial. The reportage of her courtroom sighting primarily detailed her wardrobe, with one mention on April 22nd, reporting she wore a, quote, black tailored dress, tight-fitting hat, and a black and white fox fur. She was then also set to debut in her next stage performance, a play initially titled The Triple Cross. After a short run in Boston and Connecticut, the title was changed to Set a Thief, and the production opened in New York to lackluster reviews. Natasha received kudos for being gorgeous, but her acting was panned as being mannequin. At this time, Natasha leased an apartment over a storefront at 58 West 55th Street, and there opened a couture dress boutique. She would sell her own designs and cater to an exclusive clientele, including many of her Hollywood acquaintances. Quote, Natacharambova, the name in letters of stone, appear over the shop next to Fifth Avenue. Rich fabrics and pieces of antique jewelry are in the window. Beyond, in which your curious gaze is lost, folds of gauzy green. There, Natasha designed day dresses, evening gowns, accessories, jewelry, and fabric, and pursued the development of her own makeup line. It was then she wrote her one play titled All That Glitters. In this literary endeavor, no medium was needed, no spirit guides channeled, and no dearly departed consulted. Natasha devised her screenplay herself in an effort to torch the last remnant of her Hollywood life by creating her characters as obvious movie stars she'd known. Characters not so subtly cast as Mary Pickford, Gloria Swanson, George Ullman, and Rudy himself were all written into her plotline as near libel. Natasha's character as Alice is firmly established as heroine, and she heroically rescues her immature husband. The play would not serve as a true revenge, because All That Glitters was never produced or published and had no audience. It did serve instead as her definitive and then private word on her Hollywood experience and marriage to Rudolph Valentino. In Revelations, she mourned Rudy's death and the loss of her love. In All That Glitters, she vindicated herself of the entire affair. When her mother finished reading her daughter's play, she wept and demanded Natasha burn every copy. Natasha did no such thing. With the catharsis of its completion, Natasha moved on. She was seen out and about at many Manhattan social events, and always wearing her finest haute couture designs. At the Thomas Wilfred Clavelux recital at the Gray Bar building, a teenage boy, Mark Hasselrus, remembers being starstruck by the visage of the beautiful woman wearing a turban, who arrived, as he recalled, quote, with a middle-aged woman. This middle-aged woman accompanying Natasha that evening was Alice Bailey. Natasha met Alice Bailey through her affiliations with the New York Theosophical Society, and in theosophy, the two women found friendship. Alice Bailey was the founder of the Arcane School, a theosophical educational institution providing worldwide training in the science of the soul. Alice Bailey authored 24 enormous tomes on various theosophical subjects, with titles such as Esoteric Healing, The Seven Rays of Life, and a treatise on white magic. Alice would best be remembered for first coining the phrase New Age. Alice Bailey alleged her lengthy books were telepathically dictated to her by a Mahatma, just as Helena Blavatsky alleged her secret doctrine was dictated to her by her Mahatma, and as Natasha claimed in the creation of Revelations. Natasha's friendship with Alice Bailey represented a significant change in course regarding her esoteric interests. It was Alice who first introduced Natasha to New York's trendiest school of esoteric thought, the Rurich Society. The Rurich Society was founded in New York City in 1921 by two Russians, husband and wife, Nicholas and Helena Rurich. Their society was established as the Master Institute of United Arts, and similar to Alice Bailey's Arcane School, the curriculum offered classes in all aspects of esoterica, art, and religion. Nicholas Rurich commanded his society from an imposing position as world-renowned scholar, author, and accomplished artist of spiritual landscape oil paintings depicting his treks through the India and Altai region of the Himalayas. His dedication to world order through art and peaceful political solutions would earn him a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1929, presented by the University of Paris. His wife, Helena, was also renowned as an author and authority on theosophical thought. She, as Blavatsky, Natacharambova, and Alice Bailey, alleged her writings were transcribed to her by Mahatmas. Helena held as much authority in the Rurich Society initiatives as her husband, who wrote prolifically and was and still is revered within the Rurich international community. During the 1920s, the Theosophical New York community embraced Helena and Nicholas's society as a chic new direction both philosophically and socially. Helena and Nicholas Rurich had two sons, George and Svetoslav. It would be Svetoslav who would rise to leadership within the society, being strikingly handsome with a dashing demeanor and personal style which served him well. He studied art and architecture at New York's Columbia University, and as an artist he rivaled his father's technical ability with the oils. A fashionable young gentleman sporting a goatee and tailored tweed jackets, he exuded a palpable self-assurance, an appeal all the more mesmerizing, being steeped in the metaphysical. The attraction between Natasha and Sveti, as she called him, evolved quickly into an affair, with the role of Natasha's rebound love falling to the Rurich heir apparent. Natasha and Sveti merged over their passion for all things theosophical and were soon engaged to be married. While Natasha and Svetoslav planned their life together, Georgewehner met the love of his life, Alex Rotov. Alex, a.k.a. Alexis Rotov, was a ballet dancer and a popular personality in New York's bohemian art scene. Russian by birth, his family moved to New York in 1907 when he was 5 years old. He studied ballet for 14 years with Ivan Klustin, Mikhail Mordkin, and Olga Preobryanska, and alleges to have received a scholarship granted by Anna Pavlova. Alex Rotov was, by the late 1920s, an accomplished and well-known dancer. However, Alex's 5'1" height prevented him from being cast in lead classical dance roles. He instead starred in comedic parts in which he enjoyed his success, consistently finding work and gaining notoriety for his niche performances. In May of 1927, George and his new love, Alex, embarked on a trip to Europe, where they toured the Azores, Madeira, Sicily, Greece, and Egypt. They would be gone for nearly 1 year. George and Alex visited Muzzy and Uncle Dickie at the chateau at Juanlespin in the summer of 1927, and traveled on to Switzerland to visit Paul Ivanovich in his home in Vienna. Meanwhile, in New York, Natasha was preparing for her next stage appearance. Despite her deep disappointment with the FBO film When Love Grows Cold and 2 uneventful appearances in The Purple Vial and Set a Thief, she still entertained thoughts of a career in acting. In September of 1927, she appeared in a play which was set in the Louisiana bayou titled Creoles. Quote, Creoles was a romantic comedy drama which opened at the Claw Theater. Despite a spectacular New Orleans set designed by Norman Bell Geddes, the plot of Creoles, which focused on a Covent-bred girl Jacinta and her infatuation with a Caribbean pirate, left the critics cold. End quote. Natasha goes wholesale. Throughout 1927 and 1928, Natasha continued to be Leslie Grant Scott's devoted student of theosophy. Her engagement to Svetoslav inspired her to broaden her studies to embrace all Rurich philosophies, which advanced theosophy by including doctrines of world peace and the international veneration and protection of art and nature. While delving deeper into this academia, Natasha lived as Sveti's muse. He would sketch and paint her portrait many times, enjoying a uniquely personal artistic vantage point as her lover. In 1928, Nicholas and Helena Rurich moved to the Kulu Valley in India, leaving Svetoslav in charge of the Rurich Society's New York interests. His responsibilities included the management of the Master Institute of Arts, as well as overseeing final preparations for the opening of the Master Building, the Rurich Society's prestigious skyscraper at 310 Riverside Drive. The Master Building was set to become a center for arts and philosophical study, and it would not only provide apartments and studios for working artists, but house a museum on the first 3 floors. This museum would be co-founded and managed by Natasha and Svetoslav. Their ambitious Museum of Religion and Philosophy was scheduled to open in January of 1930. In their museum prospectus materials, the officers and advisory board read as a who's who of the theosophical movement in Manhattan at the time. Svetoslav Rurich would be president, and Leslie Grant Scott vice president. Leslie would share the position with her husband R.T.M. Scott, who was nominated as chairman of the museum's Scientific Psychic Research section. This section of the museum would include classes on telepathy, clairvoyance, thought forms, auras, and more. Natasha would act as the museum's secretary-treasurer. The museum's advisory committee included Alice Bailey, as well as Nicholas Rurich, and this surely did not please Helena Rurich. Helena was a fierce opponent of Alice Bailey, and a certain jealousy seems to have existed between the two matriarchs of New York's theosophical world. Helena accused Alice of appropriating Rurich curriculum for use in her arcane school, and debunked Alice's otherworldly Mahatma as being an impostor. Natasha and Sveti walked a thin line in befriending Alice Bailey and appointing her to a position on their Rurich Society Museum's advisory committee. The rivalry between Alice Bailey and Helena Rurich was an aggressive one, steeped in accusations of an arcane nature. Helena Rurich believed Alice Bailey was appropriating her Mahatma and misrepresenting him as her own master. It appears Helena took the subject of Mahatma appropriation more seriously than did Alice Bailey. Her son, Svetoslav, or the woman he was about to marry, Natasha Rambova. Meanwhile, on the Riviera, George and Alex faced complications while visiting the chateau in juanlespin. George collapsed from what would be referred to as psychic exhaustion, with his condition so grave he required hospitalization. He attributed his illness to the strenuous psychological effort required to maintain a deep trance for his clientele. Muzzy and Uncle Dickie Hudna assumed responsibility for George's recovery and escorted him by train to Paris for medical evaluation and care. They established residency at the Hotel Saint-Raphael during his hospitalization in Paris. When Muzzy and Uncle Dickie returned to the Riviera, George remained in Paris with Alex until he was deemed well enough to travel. He and Alex returned to New York on May 1st, 1928, with the Hudnuts arriving on a different ship the same day. Muzzy remained protective of George's fragile condition, and upon their arrival she escorted him on a few weeks' vacation to San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake City. It was during this summer of 1928 when Natasha announced her dress shop was so successful she was expanding into the wholesale business. This news garnered headlines as she granted lengthy interviews in which she expounded on her theory of color in regards to women's wear. Quote, Ms. Rambova, in her New York studio, creates personality costumes and maintains that color preferences reveal the character of wearers. Her own mode of dress gives her an oriental aura, and what's more, seems exactly to suit her type. Dressing to suit one's type, you will learn it is a phrase and an idea taboo with Miss Rambova. She believes in dressing to suit personality and thinks the word type overworked to the point of exhaustion. Natasha Rambova, who confesses that she likes Persian and Hindu effects, when interviewed on colors and their significance, wore a soft gray frock cut on a straight, original line and with an embroidered bodice in an odd shade of blue. But blue and gray, she explained, were not her colors and were simply being worn for experimental purposes. Life is color. We vibrate it all the time, though we are not conscious of it, began Miss Rambova, as she sat surrounded by colorful Chinese screens, rich tapestries, oriental vases, and handsome gowns and coats of rich fabrics and of her own designing. End quote. Mr. Mundy and his soon-to-be fifth wife arrive. It was also during the summer of 1928 when Natasha's friend from Los Angeles, the prolific adventure novelist and ardent theosophist Talbotmundy, arrived in New York City. Natasha and Muzzy knew Talbotmundy from their affiliation with the West Coast Theosophical Organization at Point Loma, California, of which Mundy was an influential member. Many of Mundy's novels, such as Om, The Secret of Abhor Valley, and The Devil's Guard, included theosophical and occult themes. When Mundy arrived in Manhattan with his soon-to-be fifth wife, Dawn Allen, they soon joined the Rurich Society. Natasha and Svetoslav recruited them into the planning of the Museum of Religion and Philosophy, with Talbotmundy listed in the museum's brochure as a member of the advisory committee. Talbotmundy and Dawn Allen also hosted frequent seances for their fellow theosophists in their Greenwich Village apartment. For months, from fall to winter, Talbot, Dawn, Natasha, and a court stenographer gathered one night a week with Georgewehner. While George's recovery progressed, he penned a memoir titled A Curious Life, with Talbotmundy writing the introduction for the quizzical volume and assisting him in finding a publisher. In October, shocking news arrived from Juanlespin. Richard Hudnut died unexpectedly from heart failure. The beloved and fabulously wealthy Uncle Dickie would bequeath all but $4,000 of his fortune to Muzzy and his adopted stepdaughter, Natasha. In January of 1929, Svetoslav traveled to India, where he would remain until May, visiting his family on their estate in Kulu Valley. Talbotmundy and Dawn Allen also departed that spring on a European vacation with George. They invited him to accompany them as they were curious to witness his psychic interpretations. Quote, Wehner accompanied the couple. Talbot was curious to observe his reactions, since he had reported observing numerous psychic phenomena during his trip to Europe with Natasha 3 years earlier. They toured London, then went to Rome via Paris, seeing the churches and the ruins. End quote. The end of May, Natasha would sail again for France. She traveled to Paris to design the sets and costumes for a one-act opera performed by the American Opera at the Theatre Champs-Élysées. The opera libretto was written by the actress Minnie Maddern-Fisk and the musical score by W. Frank Harling, with the sets also attributed to designer Patrick Morgan. The opera opened on June 20th, 1929, with opinions divided on its jazzy theme. There would be 4 performances before the opera closed, after accumulating $40,000 in debt. Natasha returned to New York just in time for a meeting of the Friends of the Rurich Museum on August 18, 1929, where she was elected as an officer. The Master Building and George attempts suicide. On October 17, 1929, the Rurich Society's Master Building finally opened at 310 Riverside Drive in Manhattan. Natasha, Sveti, George and Alex, Talbotmundy and Dawn Allen all leased apartments in the building. Many members of the New York Theosophical Society also began tenancies in the upscale building, as it was advertised as a prestigious center for the arts and esoteric sciences. The intent of the venture was to inspire its tenants to higher creativity and purpose. In this, the Master Building was an immediate success. Even George would feel sufficiently recovered to resume conducting his seances, which were often held in Sveti's Master Building penthouse apartment. As Dawn Allen was a classically trained musician, she was impressed by the quality of George's pre-trance whistling and the melodies he often hummed during his seances. She and Donna Shin Russell embarked on a project to transcribe George's music and compose lyrics. Natasha organized a recital for the 2 women, with Dawn playing the piano and Donna singing. Now, although George knew about this recital in advance and was given credit as composer, in the days following the event he grew increasingly furious. He accused Dawn Allen and Donna Russell of appropriating his compositions and insisting on some sort of compensation or a public retraction. His aggressive demands generated ill will, especially in regards to his friendship with Talbotmundy. In the wake of George's nervous breakdown the previous year, his deep trance process changed radically. Don Allen would recall how during this time George seemed to be under the control of something unsettling. His temper flew, he was at times vicious, and his seance process intensified. Instead of rolling his head side to side, he would bang his head uncontrollably on the chair, with his abdomen swelling and manifesting violent reactions. During what would be his last seance with talbotmundy, Don Allen, and Natasha, held on the skyscraper terrace of Svetoslav Rurich's penthouse apartment in the Master Building, George called out that he was possessed by the spirit of a suicidal man and ran to the edge of the terrace to leap to his death. Dawn was seated near the terrace railing and grabbed George. She caught him in time but came within inches of plunging to her death along with him. This marked the end of their affiliation with Georgewehner, and he fast faded from the group's good graces. The dissolution of relations was further exacerbated when the Museum of Religion and Philosophy's opening was cancelled, and plans for its future terminated. Several reasons can be surmised as to the museum's failure. Perhaps the fall of the stock market the previous October affected funding for the Rurich Society, and mortgage payments on the Master Building became exorbitant. A more compelling reason for the termination of plans for Svetoslav and Natasha's museum was their broken engagement. By the end of 1930, Helena Rurich issued her final edict regarding the beautiful theosophist her son was planning to marry. In one of her diaries, it is revealed she felt Natacharambova was the reincarnation of Bathsheba, and because of this she was a dangerous influence on Svetoslav's karma. Helena also reiterated her challenge to Alice Bailey and implored Svetoslav to return to India to live with the family. Svetoslav complied, broke his engagement to Natasha, and ended all hopes for the museum and their happy theosophical future. Natasha was furious with Sveti for breaking their engagement and for failing to comply with the promised completion of the Museum of Religion and Philosophy. She threatened to sue him for breach of contract. Heeding the voices of reason from Aunt Teresa and her mother, Natasha instead left New York on an ocean voyage, sailing for Spain.